So, yeah, my name is Riccardo Tempesta. I am CTO at MageSpecialist. MageSpecialist is an Italian-based company, totally verticalized on Magento solutions. And of course, I'm a Magento 1 certified developer, Magento 2 professional developer as well. But most important, I am one of the most active Magento contributor in the Magento community. I was in the top contributors list of 2017, and hopefully it will be the same with 2018. And I'm also a Magento Community Maintainer. And today, it's very strange for me today, actually, because I have a kind of great honor, because I have to speak about one of the most advanced projects you may find in the whole Magento ecosystem. I'm talking about, you probably heard about this project many times, because today they told about this project, I think at least 10 times. It's the MSI. If you heard, but you have an idea on what MSI is, don't worry. But we'll not focus so much on the feature itself, because yeah, the feature is amazing, but the most important behind the MSI are all the challenges that we had to face while developing this feature that at the very beginning was seeming very simple, actually. But let's start from the very beginning. So what is MSI? MSI stands for multi-source inventory. So basically it's a very simple feature that allows you to handle multiple warehouses. Well, if you use Magento, and well, actually, if you're here, yeah, you're supposed to be using Magento, so yeah, stupid question. You know that you have one single quantity for each product. So let's say you're selling apples and oranges. You can say I have 10 apples and 5 oranges, but you cannot say I have 5 apples in the Kiev warehouse and 5 apples in the Rome warehouse. You can say I have a total of 10 apples. So this is what MSI does in few words. So basically it allows you to specify the quantity you have around multiple warehouses you can have all around the world. So my first reaction when I heard about this project, because I was onboarded very late in this project, it was about, yeah, I think 7-8 months ago, it was in a very advanced state. My first reaction was, hey, come on, it's simple, because we already have products. We create warehouses. It's simple to create a new entity. We create a table connecting them, and we store the quantity there. Yeah, come on, it's simple. It's very simple. It's a 5-minute feature. Yeah, and the funny part is that I was not drunk when I was saying this. And I will tell you a secret. Nothing takes 5 minutes, especially Magento. Yeah, not because Magento is complex, we all know. Yes, complex. You know, one of the challenges actually was to find a very effective model, because what I discovered while working with the Magento team is that when they want to create a new feature, they don't create a simple feature. I mean, something that is working. They create a framework behind this feature. They create an effective model. This is why Magento seems to be very complex, because it's very extensible. So making the feature was not enough. So one of the very first challenges was to find a very effective model. And the only way to find a very effective model is to take the reality and bring the reality to the software. To do this, one of the first options was DDD. I will explain you later why. Raise your hand if you heard about DDD. Great. Oh, usually you had just 2 people raising their hand, and I think it's something completely different. So DDD is domain-driven design. So I will try to explain, because it's very complex to explain, but the idea behind is very simple. And implementation is complex as well. So when you deal with DDD, you have to keep in mind 4 main aspects. The first one is the domain. So definition of domain is a sphere of knowledge. In this case, we are handling with inventory, so our domain is inventory. And we should have what is called a domain expert. That is someone that is very experienced with this domain. Because of course you have to understand how an inventory works, otherwise you will implement something that doesn't work in the reality. Model is a system of abstractions. Let's say it's how it works. It is not exactly like this, but there's a simple definition. And 2 aspects that from my perspective are the most important: the context and one ubiquitous language. So a context is like in the common language, so you have to define what is the meaning of a specific term in different contexts. Let's take the product. It can have a meaning in the catalog context that is different from the inventory context. We'll see later, I have an example. And a ubiquitous language, so we need the same language as the merchant, for example, because this is beyond the software, actually. When you use the same language, you basically think in the same way. So you have to speak the same language as the merchant if you want to do something that is effective for the merchant. So you have to use the same terminology, the same words, and the same way of thinking. And I want to show you why context and language are so important. So I've been Googling around, for example, the definition of a developer or a programmer around the web, and I found so many amazing definitions, like people converting cafe into code, stuff like that. But the most amazing was this one. This is not exactly a joke. So a programmer is someone who solves a problem you didn't know you had in a way you don't understand. And you're asking me why we need a common language? We need because of this, actually. This is a joke, but you have a real thing behind. And why the context is important? Do you know about the rhinoceros example? You never heard before, probably. So rhinoceros is this animal. And if you look at this, you can see, depending on the context, one picture, if we are in the photograph context, let's say, it can be one animal if we are in another context, so let's say biological context. And it can be a slide if we are in my presentation context. So basically we have one object, different representation, but we all know that actually is just a chubby unicorn. So if you take this funny example and you bring to reality, think to a product. A product from the catalog context is something that has an image, one price, attributes, and whatever. So you have this kind of representation. And from the stock perspective, is something that is physical. So it is not just the representation of the product. So you have one quantity, one availability, you have to deal with back orders, and so on. So the same thing as different representations. And this is very important because when you deal with EDD, basically what you have to do is to build the reality in the virtual world. So basically your software should be as much as possible the map of the real life territory. This is very important. This is why in the MSI we decided to create the entity that exists in the real life. So we had a source. A source is basically the physical product location. And one stock that is an aggregation of multiple sources. So why we didn't use the word warehouse? Because maybe in one warehouse you can have multiple sources inside because you can have multiple departments. This is just an example. And you can connect them. Well, I will show you with this picture that is much more effective. So you can have multiple sources, and these sources can be connected to one or more stocks, and one stock can be an aggregation of multiple sources. And one of the stocks can be connected to a website. So for example, you can have the Ukrainian website dealing with the sources in Kiev and in Rome, for example, and the Italian website that is only dealing with the Rome warehouse, for example. And everything is computed under the hood. So from the merchant perspective, it's very simple because you just input all the quantities you have in every single source of this product, and all the availability and quantity is computed under the hood. I'm using quantity and availability. In Magento 1, they were almost the same. We'll see how actually MSI changed the game in this case. So another challenge was not to affect the usability for those merchants that were using one single source. And when I say this, usually people look at me like an alien because, hey, you're talking about multi-source inventory and you can use in single source mode. So what does it mean? Well, actually, MSI is not only multiple source. It's a new way of thinking to the inventory. So basically, it will eventually replace the current Magento implementation, so you will be able to use as single source. So we didn't want to affect the usability. So if you're using in single source mode, you will have the old way of inputting the quantity. But behind this, simple example, there is a very challenging architectural problem behind, because we had the so-called default source problem. So basically, yeah, today you have one single source, let's say, and tomorrow you want to add more sources because your business is growing. So what you have to do today is to designate one source as the default source, because the catalog must know where to put the products, actually. But if you do this, well, actually, the first time I heard this, I said, yeah, the first option I have is to create one attribute in the source that is default, is a Boolean value. And if it's true, that is my default source. If it is false, of course, it is not my default source. But we have a problem behind this approach, actually, because I told you before, we have to speak the same language as the merchant, and we must respect the context. So what does it mean, default source? If you ask to a merchant, what is your default source? They will answer you, default what? So it has no meaning, actually. So basically, we cannot put the default source information inside the inventory because it's something that is needed from the catalog, but it's something that the inventory doesn't know. So it's very strange, because actually what we should do is to deal with bounded context. So it's something that is coming from the catalog context and is injecting something in the inventory context. So it's a requirement from the catalog. So the first option you had is to define that default source here in the catalog. But if you do something like this, basically you need to change the catalog implementation, the current Magento catalog implementation. And if you do this, you're violating the isolation of MSI, because MSI is supposed to be a kind of isolated plugin that I can install, turn on, and turn off. So basically, I cannot change the current core implementation of Magento. So there was a very great challenge about the modularity of this project. Because, and the solution was to create a new module that we call the inventory catalog that will handle all the inventory requirements that are in the catalog context. So basically, this is why in the MSI you will find a lot of classes like this. Because the first time I saw this, I said, hey, come on, do you really need a class to define default, one string? It was crazy at the very beginning. Then I understood that there was a problem behind, because in the previous approach, you had a tight dependency between two modules. So basically, if you wanted to add that information in catalog, they were tightly dependent. And it is not good, actually, because the current implementation of Magento, in the current Magento implementation, you have the catalog that is a kind of God module that handles everything. And we must not allow this. So the result was to create this kind of approach that is a kind of decoupled dependency. But of course, we are just talking about one stupid flag that actually became a very huge problem. So when you have to deal with this kind of architecture, you have to change your way of thinking to the software. And actually, one good point is to use the headless first approach. So the headless first means that you first think to your API, to your entities, to your whatever, and then you develop the software. All in this way, you can think to a module, only think into its responsibility. And only in this way, you have all the responsibility clear all around the modules. Because otherwise, when you don't have all the responsibility well defined across the modules, there is the chaos like you have today in Magento. And trust me, I'm Italian, I know what chaos means. So, today in Magento, basically, you don't know exactly where you can find a piece of code, because you have everything mixed up. And with the headless first approach, you actually can avoid this. This is why, for example, that previous implementation becomes something like this. So you have an additional module that is inventory API or inventory catalog API. So the API module is detached from the previous module. It is exposing the API and is connected to the back engine that is the real implementation. And all the other modules and external applications should deal with inventory through inventory API. and with inventory catalog through inventory catalog API. So basically this kind of connection between external module and inventory or inventory catalog should be not allowed. And this brings to the creation of module like this one, so inventory catalog API, in which you have all the interfaces. But if you think to this approach, actually it's very clever because it's very upgrade resilient. Because if you deal only with the API and you use only the API, basically you're pretty sure that upgrading Magento, nothing will break. This is very important, actually. And after this, you know, when you approach the software in this way, you start thinking, and finding a new solution. Another great thing was to consider the user and the merchant as one interface consumer. So we said, hey, come on, we have interfaces for application. We should have a decoupled interface for user as well. And this is what a module become in MSI. So you have the inventory implementation, inventory API, inventory admin UI implementation, and inventory front-end UI implementation. And you can replace one single module per time without breaking the whole system. They are totally almost decoupled. And the admin user and the front-end user will, of course, approach the admin panel, the front-end panel, through the inventory API, mostly through the inventory API. So this is why each single module should expose all its public functionalities only via API. This is API first, actually. And if you see, for example, this is the implementation of another module. This is module inventory sales that, of course, it has dependencies. And when possible, you should be dependent only to the API module, not to the implementation module. So in this way, you're very upgrade resilient. But of course, this kind of approach leads you to have a lot of modules. And this is what actually MSI became. So you have, I don't know how many modules. Do you remember how many modules? 30, 40, I have no idea. So yeah, the first reaction is usually panic. But I can say one thing, I told you before, when you have very well-defined responsibilities, it's very easy to find what is the piece of code that is doing something. Because today, from my perspective, the hard part when dealing with Magento is finding where something happens and changing it or modifying it. In this way, you know perfectly and exactly where that piece of code is. And you can easily replace that piece of engine, actually. So it's very convenient. And this leads to a new vision of Magento. This is not my vision, but it's a vision from one of the smartest guy in the world universe, that is Anton Krill. He's one of the Magento architect and Superman. That basically, this is his vision. So we had the catalog before. In Magento 1 and previous implementation of Magento 2, you just had the catalog module. In the future, we should have something like this. So every single part of the catalog should be splitted depending on the responsibility. So for example, you should have catalog admin, as I showed you before. Catalog GraphQL, we saw before with Matt, that is, it should be a different module, and so on. If you want, there is a, if you just go to this link or you scan this QR code, there is a very good explanation from Anton Krill about this new vision, and it's absolutely amazing. But you know that if you handle the software in this way, every time you add a new dependency can be a real problem, because adding a new dependency can lead into a new module creation. And when you create a new module, you add complexity, you add something more to check. And you should avoid as much as possible, even because every time you add a new module, Anton cries. And this is real because I will show you what happened. This is his face when I told him I removed one dependency. It's real. So now we are talking about decoupling modules, isolating, responsibility. This is very cool. So we can scale the software because we are going to a kind of microservices approach. And so we can scale, but how can we scale the database, actually? Because that is the other problem. So you can have the most efficient PHP implementation, but if you just have one database, it will be the bottleneck. So the next challenge behind MSI was dealing with the database. And this is very interesting from my perspective. So, you know, when you have to scale database, especially with MySQL, you have one huge problem: foreign keys. Because if I have one module that is depending on another module's database implementation and it's declaring a foreign key, I cannot have two separate databases, for example. I have to be in the same database. And this is a huge problem. And we also have another problem. Going back to the DDD, what I told you before, we should speak the same language as the merchant. Do you think that a numeric ID has a real meaning for a merchant? It has no meaning, because when you speak to a merchant, you don't have product 1, product 2, product 42. Absolutely. Incremental IDs are almost meaningless. So what we should do, we should decouple. So first we should decouple this dependency, so remove the foreign key, and speak the same language as the merchant by using the so-called business key. So today, when we refer to a product in Magento, we use the numeric ID. Tomorrow, we should use the SKU. So the product that yesterday was number 1, tomorrow should be ABC, where ABC is SKU. So if you approach the software in this way, and you remove the foreign keys, and you use the business keys, you totally remove all the database dependency, and you can have the information splitted all across different databases. This is very important. But of course, we have a problem that is consistency, of course, because the foreign key helps us to keep a very hard database consistency. And if we remove the foreign key, of course, we have to deal with possible inconsistency of the database. So you should keep the consistency at application level. So for example, you have to pluginize save method, delete method, update method, and whatever, to be sure. But the most effective way, actually, is to write a database inconsistency proof code. This sounds very strange at the very beginning, but it means basically that you should handle scenarios like this. So imagine you have the source item basically is the quantity of a product inside a source, let's say. Let's explain like this. And if you have a quantity defined for this product, and this product does not exist anymore, your software should be working. This is most important. And after dealing with database, we just realized one thing that is very stupid and known in the real world, but is not so immediate in the IT. Nothing is immediate in the real world. Operation takes time. This is very important because I want to show you what will happen with quantities. So, the real life has no database transaction because when you have 10 products and you have one order, you got 2 products that are ordered. In the previous Magento implementation, as soon as you have one order, you decrease the quantity. But this is not correct because in your stock you still have 10 products because you didn't ship that product, but you cannot sell 2 of them. So it's tricky because with the previous representation we just had quantity, and quantity was not enough to define the real life. And then when you ship the products, actually, you have 8 products for real. So you should deduct the quantity only when you ship, but you should not allow to buy 2 products when you are in this condition. So the solution was to approach this problem with event sourcing and CQRS. Have you ever heard about event sourcing? Raise your hand. Yeah, few people done before. So basically, event sourcing, I will try to explain because even here is a very simple, there is a very simple concept behind, but the implementation sometimes is very tricky. So basically, event sourcing is not defining something like the quantity. So we don't say I have 10 products, and the availability of the products is 10, but we rebuild depending on the history. So basically, if we have a product that it is ABC and we have quantity, we have 10 products, so the quantity is 10. In the initial state, even the availability is 10. when the order is placed, we create a reservation. So this is a representation, a simple representation of a table. So we reserve 2 products. And as you see, as I told you before, we have 2 different approaches between quantity and availability. So quantity is still 10, but the availability is the quantity minus the reservation. So this basically is much more like the reality, because in your warehouse, you still have 10 products. But you reserve 2 products, so no one can buy that products. This is why the quantity is 10 and availability is 8. They are different ideas. And then when the order is shipped, we create, actually this is a kind of, we really deduct the quantity, so the quantity become 8, and we create the so-called compensation reservation. So, otherwise, if we don't do this, basically our availability will be 6. This is how MSI works. So more in general, the quantity is the quantity itself, so how many products you have in the warehouse, and availability is your quantity minus the sum of all reservations. This is more or less event sourcing. Actually, to be 100% fair, the real event sourcing is slightly different, because in our case, we have an initial state, and in the real event sourcing, you don't have an initial state. So a very good example is your bank account, when we talk about event sourcing, because you don't have a start of your bank account. Your start is 0. Well, to be honest, it's even my current condition, I think, but it's another story. So, and then you have plus and minus transaction. And to know how much you have today in your bank account, you have to rebuild the whole history. This is event sourcing. And this is very good because it's very modeling the reality. And as I told you before, when you want to have a very effective model, you have to look what happens in the reality. And this brings to CQRS. I'm pretty sure that most of you know about CQRS. So CQRS stands for Common and Query Responsibility Segregation, I'm sorry. So basically, as I told you before, we have 2 different representations of the same idea. So we have quantity and we have availability. So basically, we write the quantity. This is the command. A command is something that changes the state of an application. We have a projection. That is that operation I showed before. So basically, quantity plus all the reservations. And we read the availability through a query. A query is something that reads from the state and doesn't change for any reason the state. So this is a kind of CQRS, because we write in one way and we read something that is represented in a different way. So we have different representation. And behind this, we have a lot of benefits, actually, behind CQRS, because if you look at the previous implementation, we have, for example, the source item quantity that can be defined here, reservation, and through a projection, we have an availability. And if we want to scale, in the future, we could have different databases, for example. So you can have one table for each database. This is just an example, but you can do that. Of course, we are not still doing here, but potentially you can do that. So that are only few challenges behind MSI. But what I understood actually is that usually one does not simply develop MSI. Actually, I think in the world, only 2 people can develop MSI in a few minutes. One is here, and is Igor. I'm sorry, I know Igor since 2 years ago, but I still cannot pronounce his last name. And the second one is not here. I'm sorry, it's Chuck Norris. This is a joke, but I wanted to add the Igor picture actually here, because when you work with MSI, and I consider, I'm not, of course, a Magento employee, I'm just a Magento developer, I have my company. But when you work with MSI, you have the opportunity to work with the most talented developers in the world universe, I think. And Igor actually is one of them. So is one of the side effects of contribution, actually. And we didn't see a lot of other challenges we had behind MSI, but I want to just name some of them. So, eventual consistency, asynchronous API and bulk API, it's a very interesting topic because you will see in another speech from Alexander Lizun that will take place, I don't know if it is the next one or later. It's another community project, and we had the opportunity to take the experience of this project inside the MSI. So basically from 2 projects, we had a real feature in the MSI, and it was very interesting. We had validation chain, conditional chain, multidimensional indexing, configuration proxies, a lot of them actually. You could create a speech for each of them. It's amazing. And this was just a 5-minute feature. So after this, after looking to all the challenges behind MSI, if you want to really grow from a developer's perspective, I suggest you to contribute to Magento and especially to MSI, because MSI currently is from my perspective, is the most advanced thing you may find in the Magento world. And Magento is advanced by itself, but MSI is simply amazing. There's nothing like MSI. You can look, you have clean code, you have clean implementation, you have an architectural vision. So it's amazing. And if you're just scared that it's so advanced project, don't worry, because there are weekly online meetings. There are even YouTube recordings of the meetings, so you can go there and look to all the previous meeting we had. Is just amazing. So I realized it was amazing when I looked back to my code, to the code I wrote 6 months ago before the MSI, and actually I'm not very proud today of that code. So you realize you're growing from that perspective when it happens. And if you want to contribute, what can I say? Just onboard it, and you will have the opportunity to be brother in arm with Igor. Well, actually, yeah, he's not Russell Crowe, actually, it's Igor, if you didn't notice. And I want to say, yeah, I use Photoshop, of course, Adobe Photoshop. And anyway, thank you for your time, and